there's a culture-wide climate of where political violence is both more salient and more normalized, pervasive.
This was the first presidential campaign that I can think of in the modern era that demonized large part of the American population. Trump was, it's immigrants, it's Democrats, it's free traders. They've destroyed the country. You had these people who looked like a tribe marching around Charlottesville, and Trump couldn't give a decisive condemnation of it.
So, Onkar, we've talked a lot on the podcast over the last few years about political violence, and it's not new with this Trump administration. We saw it in the previous one. It goes back to, I think, a big episode was the Charlottesville rally, Unite the Right. And the other day we were talking about doing this podcast around political violence, and you brought up that you think the focus should be that there's something special about Donald Trump. You wanted to single out Donald Trump as a factor in the culture of political violence that we've been seeing here. And I wanted to start with that. So tell me why you think that's the case, because I can think of counter arguments and counterpoints, and I want to bring those forward.
For two reasons. We've done a few episodes about different segments of the political violence that is occurring. We did on the Trump assassination attempt. We've talked about the Charlie Kirk actual assassination. But we have not talked about who I think is the figure most responsible for the rise of political violence in America. And that's most responsible, not solely responsible, not the only one, but most responsible. And that's, you could see this after the Charlie Kirk assassination, that many commentators, especially who think of themselves as conservative or MAGA, who wanted to talk about, we've got a climate where we've got actual or attempted assassinations of people, and that there's something disturbing about this, but they could not mention Trump, let alone discuss him in any way that I think is intelligible and true about his role in this climate. And that tells you something significant. This is the president of the United States, two-time president of the United States. And if he's stoking a resort and an appeal to force and to violence, that's really, really significant. And the fact that it can't even be openly discussed by people on the conservative MAGA axis, that's disturbing.
What would you say to someone who argues, well, they don't do that because there's nothing special about his statements? Look at the person who pulled the trigger when Charlie Kirk was murdered. It was not someone who would be identified as a MAGA loyalist or Trump loyalist, quite the opposite. The person who attempted to assassinate Trump certainly wasn't one. Think of the George Floyd riots after he was murdered in Minnesota, and those were clearly from the other political tribe. So what wouldn't part of the answer that they don't want to highlight Donald Trump because there's nothing distinctive about what he's doing?
There is something distinctive about what he's doing. And for that, you have to zoom out, I think, to really see it and to grasp it. You have to think of what his campaign was in 2016. I wrote about this immediately after his election victory. And I would single out three things that I wrote about there in the immediate aftermath that I think Trump is in some form aware of. So this was the first presidential campaign that I can think of in the modern era that demonized like large part of the American population. So as I wrote about, it's common for politicians to attack each other, to attack their records of you were useless when you were in office, even to attack them personally in the way that Trump tried to delegitimize Obama, that he's, where's the birth certificate? Is he even an American? He's an illegitimate president. Already that was a bit unusual of how strongly Trump towed that line. But if you think of his campaign and Bernie Sanders' campaign were the two campaigns that demonized Americans. Bernie Sanders, it's the 1%, the rich, Wall Street. They're not really American. They're destroying the country. Elect me and I'm going to do something about these your enemies. That is your American citizen enemies. And Trump it's the elites, it's the media and journalists, it's immigrants, but that didn't mean just illegal immigrants. It's immigrants, it's Democrats, it's free traders. They've destroyed the country. We're like in an abysmal shape. You have to elect me to fight these enemies from within. It was over and over in his campaign, and he was aware of this. So people have brought this up recently. I wrote about this in the aftermath of 2016 because Trump made a big deal of it. When he said, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters. He meant that in the sense that he meant I've got this fanatical support that I could resort to violence and they wouldn't care. And I would say it's even greater than that. It's what a significant, I think a minority of the voters for Trump, but a significant minority. So another thing I wrote about after the 2016 election is the most disturbing political poll that I had seen, both for that election, but for any election really in America, was the amount of Americans who agreed or strongly agreed that we need a president who will say and do anything, and anything meant anything, to save the country. And again, it was Trump supporters who were the highest of who would say we agree or strongly agree, and Bernie Sanders supporters. Bernie Sanders didn't win the election, and I actually think he's unelectable could he win the presidency could he win that much of the country? I think the answer is no. But Trump won on this. And if you don't see that as at least have a question mark, that's giving voice and power to someone who's riding on we need brute political force, power, violence to restore the country to American greatness or make America great again. And I think like if you didn't see that in his presidential campaign in 2016, then much of what's happened might be you don't really understand it. You think it's one-off kind of thing, but I think that's just a mistake in terms of understanding the campaign and the follow-through on the campaign.
I'm just thinking of some of the comments that I remember during the first campaign at rallies. And there's one incident where someone was heckling or disturbing the rally. I think Trump's statement was rough him up. If people get rowdy, let's show them the fist, in effect. And that's my impression is that's a kind, certainly not isolated, but it comes up a lot. Even the chants about Hillary Clinton, lock her up. You should lock people up when they've gone through a legal procedure and been found guilty of a crime that warrants locking up. Not we already know, and the all that's left is the punishment. I wanted to ask you here how this connects with a theme that we've talked about a lot in the previous episodes around political violence, which is tribalism. So tribalism comes up a lot, and I think you put it in terms of there's a small but significant minority of Trump supporters who are fanatical, and I think of that as they're representatives of a tribal mentality in a profound way. How do you connect this to the broader phenomenon of tribalism? Because I think of that as a significant dynamo of political violence, and that accounts for why it's not localized with the MAGA crowd. So how do you fit that together?
Yeah, I think there's many connections. Here's a couple. So part of what a descent into tribalism means is you don't see the people outside of your tribe as fully human, but it actually also means you don't see the people within your tribe as fully human. To think of people as tribal means they're not defined by their ideas and by their choices, but by their unchosen group membership. And like some tribes, you might think, yeah, I can join it. But the essence of the tribe is we're tied together either by bloodlines, by blood and soil, like a terminology that's being increasingly used to describe real Americans. Again, a terminology that's increasingly used. That's how you see your people within in your in group. So who you think of as part of my tribe, you don't see people inside your tribe as fully human. If what fully human means, it's a capacity to think and to choose, and you then judge them by how good their thinking is and how good their choices are, how true their thinking is, and do they care about the truth, and do they care about right and wrong, and they're trying to choose what's right. Like that's, if you think of a person as an individual like that, then his memberships in various groups, his bloodlines, where he happens to be born, are all so much besides the point. That's what it means to see somebody as human. To not see them as human is, you don't think really of your own tribe like this. You certainly don't think of the outside tribe like this, as it's capable of thinking and of choosing what's right. And so there's this incredible gulf of how do you deal with the other tribe? You can't really reason with them. In the end, you can't even trade with them. You can't have some kind of relationship that's to mutual benefit, because that requires people's thinking and people's choices. And when they reach agreement, they make an agreement, and when they can't, they go their separate ways. And so you're projecting someone who's reasonable, capable of being good. And if you don't really think of that, that's really true of people, then the only resort in the end to how to deal with people is, we're going to push them around. We're going to control them. We're going to be the masters. They're going to be the servants, or vice versa. It's they've been the ones who've been killing us, robbing us. Like, think of Trump's rhetoric about immigrants, which was obviously not true, but it didn't matter because people weren't actually concerned with it. We've got millions of immigrants who are killers and rapists, and they're destroying the country. The country would look radically different if that were true, because they simultaneously say, like, look at the open borders, the millions of people who've streamed in, and they're all racist and rapists and killers, or about to kill. And if that were really true, you couldn't walk outside in any major city, in any place has taken all these immigrants, like Minnesota, and it would be a hellhole. They project it as that, but it's a fantasy of what is actually going on, and that, like, that dehumanizing is what tribalism does.
Yeah, I was just thinking, just a few examples that come to mind here is from 2023, these immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. That's a direct quote. Or they're garbage. That's the most recent one about, I think, Somali immigrants in Minnesota. You mentioned rapists. They're emptying out of mental institutions and coming into the country. Another one is they make Hell's Angels look like the sweetest people on earth. And of course, this isn't a complete list, but to tie it to tribalism. It's interesting. You mentioned that it often becomes about the blood or genetics or biology, because there's a close connection with racism. The one that stood out to me, I was reading about this, is there's a statement from Trump about immigrants and how when there's a murderer, it's in their genes. And we got a lot of bad genes in our country right now. That's another direct quote. So I see where you're coming from and the way tribalism interacts here. I want to think about what are some of the major episodes. I'm going to give you a list of some cases, and I want to hear from you. What do you take to be either turning points or major important cases? And we can dwell on these and park on them. So, and again, this is not a complete list, but these are the ones that occurred to me when I was thinking about our conversation. So one, August 2017, we already mentioned it, Charlottesville, Virginia, Unite the Right rally. One of the people involved in the counter protest was killed by a car being rammed into it. June 2017, there's a congressional baseball game practice, and someone comes along and tries to shoot some of the Congress people. October 2018, the Tree of Life Synagogue is shot up in Pittsburgh. There are 11 people who die. May 2020, the riots following the killing of George Floyd, not only in Minnesota but around the country, and chaos like we haven't seen in a long time in many cities. Just to zoom through a few more, October 2022, an attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi. 2024, the attempted, of course, we mentioned this earlier, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. Then, and I think this isn't an example of political violence, but it speaks to the handling of political violence. And we did an episode on this with my colleague, Ben Bayer, in January 2025, when Donald Trump is inaugurated. Very soon, there's a shower of executive orders, including a blanket pardoning and commuting of sentences for the people involved in January 6th, which was its own kind of episode, which I skipped over because I thought it's important to talk about both that it happened and then how it was addressed. And I'm going to skip over some others. There was an attack on the governor's mansion in 2025 in Pennsylvania, and still other cases that we could talk about into the present. Which of these stand out to you as particularly significant? Which of these are more relevant to your view that Trump has a distinctive role in fostering this climate?
The ones that stick out are the ones where he has direct involvement and what his reaction to the. So if you take a direct involvement, I don't mean he's involved in the violence. I mean he weighs in on the issue. So if you take the Nancy Pelosi and her husband, the amount of ridicule and downplaying of that incident, both by the sort of Trump administration, people sort of enamored with the Trump administration, the MAGA crowd, was significant. And as against when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, you can't say anything about this. They're sort of trying to police social media for anyone who's saying anything about this, whereas there were jokes about, and now fortunately her husband was not killed, so the episode is less severe than what happened to Charlie Kirk, which was an assassination. But when you compare the if it's our tribe, it warrants one kind of reaction, and if it's the other tribe, it warrants a different reaction. But to say that Trump is the person who I think is most culpable here is not to say he's the only person culpable, and not even to say he's the only person who has a high degree of culpability. So if the episodes you brought up that is significant, really, really significant, I think, in terms of unleashing political violence, is the George Floyd rioting, rioting is putting it a little tame when you take over police stations and so on. It's a complete lawlessness, and the reaction of the Democratic establishment. You didn't have a president cheering it on, and Trump was in the White House at the time. And that, like, the president is supposed to be a unifying figure. He's supposed to be a figure who represents all Americans. It's the executive branch, and law should apply equally to all Americans, not it applies in one way to people who vote for you and another way to. So it's right to think of the president as a unifying figure. And I think one of the reasons the Democrats are, particularly for presidential elections, are so hampered is they have never faced the fact of how the Democratic establishment reacted to, and what they didn't always, and maybe even you might say they didn't predominantly cheer on the riot, but they looked the other way, and they wouldn't talk about them, and they downplayed what was going on. And it's like, instead of saying, yeah, a lot of these are really violent, it was mostly peaceful protests. Well, what about the ones that aren't? Like, that's mostly, what about? And it was like, they so didn't want to talk about that. So there's a lot of culpability for for other figures of unleashing, of making political violence seem normal and something that, yeah, you're going to have to resort to that if you're trying to get your way. So my view certainly is not that Trump is the only one culpable here, or significantly culpable, but he is the president, and he was the president. And when you're looking at what he does as president, so Charlottesville, I think this is what it's the episode. So this is about what, a year and a half into his presidency or something like that. Or is it even less than that? It
happened in August 2017, so it's 8 months into his administration.
And that episode has now been rewritten. What people think about Charlottesville is not what actually happened. And I live in Virginia and happened to be sort of home that weekend with nothing to do. So I basically watched the news 24/7. And what was revealing was you had these people who looked like a tribe, marching around Charlottesville, Unite the Right rally of denouncing people, including Jews. Jews will not replace us. There were a Jewish synagogue of the people there had to flee through the back door because they were scared of these people marching around with tiki torches and so on. And Trump couldn't give a decisive condemnation of there's people have, part of the rewriting is what he said after the weekend is imported back into what happened during the weekend. And what was interesting in that episode is there were Republicans. So this is when you started to see sort of a split of Republicans or conservatives who could not abide by this versus conservatives who could. I remember watching, and you can see this on YouTube, Charles Krauthammer, he was still alive at this time, a longtime conservative who, was really, really critical of Trump's behavior, because it was like you're offered a layup, to use a sports, like an easy basket of all you have to do is condemn these people who are anti-Semitic, who are, what they're projecting is we're going to get our way by violence. And just as a president, you can just like outright condemnation of this. And his response was wishy-washy. And and then I think Laura Ingraham was defending Trump, and you could start to see the split among conservatives that, Trump's on the side. If he thinks these people might help him, might vote for him, did vote for him, he has one kind of view about it. And like the idea that he's good on anti-Semitism. The Charlottesville episode should have said, no, he's not. But it was this political violence, and like the threat of it, which is, he sort of looked the other way. It was clear it didn't bother him very much. That's the sort of the best you can say. And it started to even more split the conservative movement. And that was like, it should have told the country something about his attitude towards the use of political force to get your way.
I wanted to talk about the issue of, you made the point that there's culpability elsewhere, not only with Trump, but there's something distinctive about his culpability being the president, being someone who is looking the other way, as in Charlottesville. I remember we had a conversation around soon after the January 6th, the storming of the Capitol, the riot there, and the invasion of the building. And one of the things that people were arguing at the time, and I think this is part of the narrative that you're pushing against, which was the people who didn't want to lay the blame at Trump's feet. One of the things that was being said at the time is, well, it was not that long ago when we saw cities burning and anarchic zones in cities like Portland and Seattle. What are you getting so upset about? All these people did is they marched toward the Capitol. There's some video that you can take out of context that makes it look like they're just peacefully entering the building. What's the big deal here? So there was already the beginnings of the whitewash, but it was mostly, look what that other tribe did. that was a big deal. And I think what gave that, I'm just sort of connecting this to what you said, what gave that some purchase in people's thinking was the downplaying of the BLM riots or the George Floyd riots, whichever way you want to describe it. So then when January 6th happens, it's, well, we're not nearly as bad as those other people. And then then you get an ongoing narrative that continues to rewrite it to the point where it was just a day of love and peace, as paraphrasing Donald Trump's statement. So I'm just interested from that perspective, how you see that sort of the interplay of the two kinds of tribes viewing each other and their actions toward their political violence and pointing fingers at each other as a way to normalize it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's part of what you're saying, I think, is the right way to look at it. It's a tribal kind of argument, but it's a pseudo argument. Is look how bad the other side is. Why do you have a problem with what we're doing? Look how bad the other side is. Now, I think January 6th is worse than the BLM riots, the George Floyd riots.
Why is that? Why is that?
But let me, we'll get to that in one second, but let me say, even if you thought it's not, the idea that you're using the George Floyd riots as your bar, that is such a perverse bar. Look, we're not as bad as that. This is looting in the streets, takeover of police stations and so on. And, oh, we're not doing that. So why do you have a problem with us? Really? Like, you can only have a problem with what someone's doing and the way they're resorting to force if it's at the level of the what someone thinks of as what the level of the George Floyd riots was. So just on the face of it, it's such a bad argument. But then if you couple it with the January 6th was worse than the George Floyd riots because it was much more explicitly about using a show of force to disrupt a major political moment in the United States. So the transfer of power from one administration to another is, the U.S. is right to think of it as, if you leave aside, I mean, it's important to leave aside the Civil War, that like we have an untarnished record of doing this. It's important that Washington set the precedent for doing this, that it's, yeah, no, I'm not going to be president for life. And it's important that they see that the country can go on, that I step down. I mean, anyone who's watched the Hamilton musical has seen, like, this is, and it's right to emphasize this part of Washington as this is on you. And they have the in the musical, the King of England, it's really, that's something you can do, relinquish power as a kind of, but it's like, that is rightly seen as a major American achievement of this transfer of power from administration to administration. And given when the U.S. becomes the most powerful country in the world, and it's still able to do that, you don't get someone who now, the guy wield the power and I'm not giving it up. So it wasn't some small thing to say, oh no, we're going to not count the votes or we're going to send them back. And then you had a conflict between Pence and Trump, where his vice president thought, and rightly thought, that I don't have the constitutional power to do this. Trump did not argue, because he doesn't know the Constitution. I don't think he's ever read the Constitution from cover to cover. He did not argue, oh no, you really do have the constitutional power. It's, you should do it because this is what I want and this is what the people supporting me want, and stop the steal. That's what you should do. And to resort then to force, to disrupt this with the calls of to hang Mike Pence because he won't do the president's bidding. Even though, like, there was no reason to think he wasn't sincere in his view that I don't, and like, that's part of why you have a vice president. Yeah, the vice president and the president can disagree. The vice president has certain obligations. He's the tiebreaker vote in the Senate, and it can't be like the president gets to command what that vote is. That's a thing, like, it matters that it's not the president, it's the vice president who has this vote. And Trump, Pence, whatever you think, and I have sort of a very mixed view of Pence, but took that seriously. And that's what Trump was trying to do away with. And we did a long podcast on this after a few days after January 6th. And thought of it, and I think it's right to think of it, as it's a terrorist attack in the sense, if you think of terrorism as it's resorting to violence to disrupt the political environment of who you're targeting, to make them scared to vote, to make them scared to adopt some policy. And so that's what January 6th was.
Yeah, I wanted to distinguish two things that I'm hearing, and I think these are definitely right. So one is there's a culture-wide climate of where political violence is both more salient and more normalized, pervasive, and I think this is true of Trump, that as a leader, as a president, he has a comfort and an open, maybe even an embrace of the use of force in a way that is unusual. Maybe, I don't know if it's unique in history, but it's definitely unusual for an American president. And by that, I mean, there are ways in which he speaks to people in a bullying, hectoring way, and he encourages that. So if you think about some of the things he does on social media by giving people nicknames and in terms of abuse, and the way you've already talked about the dehumanizing language around immigrants and non-American, certain sectors of the American economy, American population, and then sort of broadening this to the idea that if he calls up election officials in Georgia and they can find him the votes that he needs, and there's this recording that we talked about in a podcast many years ago, that whole idea of just using your muscle, your weight. And I think it is, in a way, an intimidation mode. Just interested in your reaction to that, because to me, that they go together. Both the sort of the culture-wide climate is reinforced by, if you have someone with significant, sort of the most powerful man in the country, most powerful man on the planet, arguably, whose attitude is, yeah, I'm going to just bully people until I get what I want. I'm going to threaten them. And I expect them to do what I want, as you gave the example with Pence, and then sort of that amplifying a culture-wide phenomenon. Does that ring true to you?
Yes, and here it's important that it's the president. The president does it openly, and he doesn't lose support. If anything, he gains support. So when you talk about the threats, just the threats around January 6th and its aftermath of election officials, when you read about what their lives are like after Trump singles them out as, you're not doing what I want, you're obstructing the process, you might be corrupt, their life is hell. They get all kinds of threats, threats against them, threats against their family, threats of being raped, or their wife's being raped, or the daughter's being raped. They get death threats. It's when you read some of this, now it's true, this is part just social media's environment that is like really toxic. And my view is a significant amount of it should be illegal, but it's, you have a president who knows, like, it's impossible for him at this point, but it's true in January 6th, to not know that this is what he's unleashing. And this is part of what the relevance of the comment. I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone. I wouldn't lose support. What that also means is I can target whoever I want, and my supporters won't think there's something bad about me targeting. Indeed, they'll go after who I'm targeting. If you contrast that to, and Hillary Clinton was rightly criticized, but she's not president, rightly criticized when she's sort of characterizing, and it wasn't clear, is she characterizing all Trump voters, some subset of Trump voters, as a basket of deplorables. This was, how can a political figure say this about Americans? And it's right. Like, that is not, you can think of Trump as deplorable. It's another thing to a large swath of the population who are voting for him to label them all deplorable without knowing much about them. I mean, that's part of what the 2016 election revealed, is how little Democrats know about the whole country. So, but she was criticized for that. And Trump is not criticized, and certainly not criticized by his base for the way that he targets people, knowing that they're going to be subject to incredible levels of threats. And it's true that that happens some from the other side. But it's not true that Obama did this. That Obama, as just sort of a matter of course, and a matter of course for Trump means basically every day, certainly every week, he will target somebody he's targeting Olympians now. And one of them, I watched some of what they had to say. The idea that, what's her name, Amber Glenn, if you watch her in the press conference, you might disagree with what she said and sort of what she thinks the climate is in the U.S. and what it's like for the, as I think the question was, the LGBTQ and maybe Q plus community in the, but the idea that this is some enemy who needs to be targeted, I think you watch it and you would think, this is a sweet young woman. Uh, and that's all Trump knows. Like that, Trump doesn't know anything about that. That's part of what's relevant. And to target these Olympians when they're at the Olympics because they don't say exactly what he wants them to say about America. And notice he can criticize America and Americans and a huge, like it's where the if we had 4 more years of Biden, the country would have been destroyed. That's part of what he said, which means everybody supporting that, they would have destroyed the country in 4 years. And here you have an Olympic athlete saying, yeah, like I'm a little mixed about representing the U.S. right now because what is going on. And you're going to target that person that she went off social media because of all the threats and so on. And again, at the time when she's competing. And if you don't think like this is something new that you can imagine, whatever you think, and we were not complimentary towards Obama, you cannot imagine Obama doing this and you can imagine doing it like to 1 or 2, just like Olympic, like let's say he didn't like the Olympics, then he would do it to Olympic, but Trump does it to everybody. He does it to Rob Reiner, and this is something new, and I think it turns, like if you think of post-World War II, unprecedented.
I was just going to react to something you said about our criticism of Obama. I think it's important to put that a little more forcefully. Not only were we highly critical of Obama, we went out of our way to expose the nihilism of the Obama administration's policies towards America. I think you or Iran had put the point, Obama was the first anti-American president at the time, and we were open about that. We characterized Obama's signature healthcare bill, the Obamacare as we now live under it, as a fascist policy, because I think it is a fascist policy. It controls a whole industry while leaving the semblance of private control, private ownership. We saw, I think, Obama objectively as a threat to America's distinctive character, its political system, the egalitarianism of Obama's statements. We went after him all the time. So I think it's important to say all that because, and again, this is not to say Obama is in some respects better than Trump, but this highlights the ways in which Obama was different. And there was one example that I think speaks to your point about how Trump is able to criticize America and Americans and institutions, and he's not criticized for it. He doesn't lose support, he gains support. I remember Obama was critical of the Supreme Court justices in one of his State of the Union addresses, or when he goes and speaks before Congress. It's not always called that. And that was an outcry. I remember it vividly, where people were losing their minds because Obama said something critical with the Supreme Court justices present in the room as they were and that there's nothing comparable when Trump is criticizing both the Supreme Court and lower level judges all the time. I think there was a case of a Supreme Court, not a Supreme Court judge, but a district court judge who I think had a Hispanic sounding name or Spanish sounding name, and Trump disagreed with him. I think that's part of what I see here as definitely new, but there's a way in which it isn't new, because I want to tie this to something I've been thinking about. So I'm collaborating with our colleague Nico Soterakopoulos on a course which is essentially the history of authoritarian movements in the 20th century into the 21st century. And I've been reading a lot of material about the rise of Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany in the early decades of the 20th century. One of the things that leapt out at me in thinking about today's conversation is this climate of normalized political violence that we've been talking about today, but that was a hallmark of both societies, both when the fascists were rising in Italy to the point where Mussolini becomes the leader, and in Germany. They're very different cases in many of the details, of course, but we talked about in the transfer of power in the US. You made that point just a few minutes ago, and how at the time we were critical of the idea that Trump wasn't willing to promise a peaceful transfer of power. And one of the things that he said in advance of the 24 election was, if I lose, it's rigged. If I win, I win. And I think the combination of that and the combination of January 6th as recent memory created an implication of, you better vote for me or else there'll be violence. And I think there were a lot of people anticipating it's going to be worse than January 6th. And I think there are people even now thinking, what's going to happen in 2026 in midterms? What's going to happen at the next presidential elections? That really has a strong antecedent in the climate in Italy and in Germany as those movements were rising. So there were thugs that were affiliated with the fascist movement who would intimidate people at voting stations. And there were pitched battles between the fascists and the communists in the streets in a way that we now think of rioting, but with two sides fighting. And the same is true in Germany in the rise of the Nazis to power. The idea that you would just walk down the street and there would be a pitched battle between opposing tribes dressed differently, literally paramilitary groups, that was part of what the daily atmosphere was at that time. I'm not claiming right now that we have that, but I'm saying that the when you get a climate of something nefarious and evil and destructive, the more it becomes prevalent, the more normal it becomes, and the more people become accepting of it. And that is a really destructive pattern, because you don't notice how bad something is. And so you made the point of how Obama wasn't singling out people the way Trump is singling them out. We've had so much of Trump that I think even people who are critical of Trump have lost the energy to criticize him in ways that they should be doing. And so any reactions to that?
Yeah, so that's, I mean, when people talk about things being normalized, that's part of what it means. That it is, at the start, you will think, oh, this is something new. We've got to oppose this. This is outrageous. But the more and more it happens, it's you just lose the energy, and you start to accept it as, okay, this is now what our political environment is like. So that the normalizing effect makes it that from two directions. It's the people who think, yeah, I could do this kind of thing, they're emboldened, and the people who would oppose it become less and less eager and have the energy to oppose it. And so you see more and more of it. I mean, we're talking about here political violence, and we haven't even talked, like, there's so much to talk about pre-ICE, that, and it's important, I think, to see that whole context, as this is all happens before the way that they're doing immigration enforcement in Trump 2.0, which I think is deliberate projection of force and force against Americans. So force in America against Americans. So like for Trump, the first administration, we haven't even talked about the love for dictators that he projected, but just we don't need to talk about it, but just like what it means to normalize how unprecedented it was for a president of the US not to look the other way towards dictators, not even to say that we have to ally with a dictator against Stalin against Hitler, which was a travesty, but to do that, when you start projecting, as some people did, Stalin's a good guy, that is like it's so abysmally evil to do that. And Trump did that with someone who we didn't need to ally with, who was not the North Korean dictator. It was like we fell in love together. And the idea that, so even if you leave aside Putin and that relationship, the idea that an American president could say that a dictator, and this is a dictator who kills thousands and thousands and thousands of his own people. I mean, it's not his people, but people in his country. Like, it's a depraved human being. Just to project some respect for that is an abomination. To say you've fallen in love with that is yeah, you've fallen in love with someone who murders on whim. And if that's not like a normalization of, yeah, it's okay to settle political disagreements by force, like what would be? And when you get to Trump 2.0, part of what it is I think that in Trump 1.0, the first administration, we were held back too much by people who had qualms, and rightly had qualms about all of this. And so we'll get rid of those people. We'll bring in people who don't have qualms about this. And we'll project force much more openly. So you brought up about the elections. People have made this point, and I think it is, there for sure is a connection of getting Americans normalized to soldiers on the streets. And then there's the war, like, is it going to be in the midterm elections, or are there going to be soldiers everywhere? And the margin, so again, you have to think about the margins. The last election, they've been fairly close. And it's, yeah, so there will be diehard people who will go out to vote, even if there's soldiers there. And so, but the person who's at the margin, well, like, I prefer this candidate a little bit, but if I go, am I going to be harassed? Am I going to be asked if I'm a citizen? And if I can't show that I'm a citizen, what's going to happen to me? And like, maybe I'm just better off not voting. And that's political intimidation. That's a use of force to intimidate politically. That's part of saying, I don't know what will happen if I lose the 2024 election. It again, that affected people's votes, because the person who thinks, yeah, do I want another something like January 6th? I don't. Maybe I prefer Kamala Harris a little bit, but not enough to risk that. So maybe I won't vote, or I'll vote for Trump. That's using force to sway elections. And he already telegraphed that for 2024, of whether he would accept it. But this of having soldiers all over the place in America, that should not be acceptable.
You mentioned the North Korean leader. I wanted to share this because this was always something that stuck with me as horrifying. So I think this is a statement from Trump from 2024 about Kim Jong-un. Quote, he is the head of a country, and I mean, he's the strong head. Don't let anyone think anything different. He speaks, and his people sit up at attention. I want my people to do the same. End quote. And there's something revealing there. I don't think he's just saying that because he thinks it's going to win people. I think that's what he believes. I think that's a sincere assessment of Kim Jong-un, and I think it's a sincere statement of what he actually wants. And I think it's reflected in some of the things we've already talked about, the bullying and the intimidation. I wanted to say something, or just probe a bit this last comment of yours about this climate of intimidation around the elections. The counterpoint to that would be Trump is not literally telling people stay home. He's no one in the GOP is telling people don't vote. In fact, they're doing the opposite. How can you say they're trying to stop people voting? And I think it's a direct analog to, well, it wasn't a MAGA person who pulled the trigger in each case. There was certainly people on the other side. How are you making it the case that it's just Trump? I'm interested in how you think about that.
Well, in this case, the sort of militarization of the police, of ICE enforcement, is happening under the Trump administration. So when you look at the numbers, I mean, there was a reason Obama was called the deporter in chief, of how many people were deported under his two administrations. But what was not so projected was the open use of force, a kind of lawlessness that now people have seen in Minnesota with the shootings, and the way that the administration automatically, without any evidence, indeed with counter evidence, of this is a domestic terrorist and they feared for their life and they did it. It was all the ICE agents were completely justified. That's the immediate reaction to it, and it's a projection of force in a way that is, you have to take that seriously, as that's intended. It's meant. When Kristi Noem is taking photo ops in front of the El Salvadorian prison, which is not a prison in the normal sense of, if you think like there's due process and the people have been convicted by a rational process and then end up in a maximum security prison. You can't think of that like it's a maximum security prison. And this made headline news. It makes it into South Park and so on for a reason, because it is something new that you have a U.S. government official posing as a photo op outside one of these. It's like posing at a Russian gulag and saying, look how good, and we've sent some people here, and look how good this is. It's so monstrous. And that, but it's intended, like it's a photo op. This is what they want to project. And it's in that context, then if people, it's not just immigrants who are allowed to be here or immigrants who are exercising First Amendment rights that ICE has gone after. It has caught up U.S. citizens. It's caught up legal immigrants who have a right to be here, or right, really, they have government permission to be here, and that people would think, yeah, like there's now soldiers at the polling booths and so on, and I'm going to think twice before going there. That it's not unreasonable to think. Like, I think twice. I'm an immigrant going through the border now in a way that I did not think of. And that's what they're projecting. Like, they're projecting, yeah, you should think about that because we're watching you. And that's the atmosphere, and it's intended. Like, it's not just, oh, this is the atmosphere because it's been wrong policies and they made all kinds of mistakes. This is by design. And that's what's important, I think, about understanding the current environment.
This issue of creating a sense of urgency and emergency, and the idea that, and I think that definitely goes along with forces the means by which we address political disputes or disagreements in every case, not just in the cases where it's necessary in self-defense. That definitely has echoes to the way the Mussolini and Hitler regimes operated. It was, you create, if there isn't already one, a sense of crisis. And then you tell people that if you want peace and if you want calm, and if you want stability, there's only one path. You need to trust me. I alone can save you. And I think we've heard that from Trump in various words. That, I think, goes along with, there's a way in which you could argue, I'm curious if you find this resonant, that you could argue that there's a certain advantage. Someone with an authoritarian inclination or a desire for more power like this, they benefit the more that political violence is normalized, regardless of who's behind it. Because the more that becomes part of the fabric of, this is what our society looks like, not everyone's going to become numb to it. I think it's going to be scary, and as it should be. And the more that's felt that way, the more it seems like, well, yeah, maybe American carnage is the reality, which is the slogan that we heard in Trump's first inaugural address. That wasn't even close to true at the time he said it. And it's not, I don't think it's even true today, as bad as things have become. But the idea that you create fear, and you sow fear, and I think there's something important there about forces everywhere. What are you going to do about it? Who are you going to turn to? And that seems like it's that's part of what I find ominous about this. Not only the incidents and the various episodes we've been talking about.
Yes, I agree with that. It will often be put as there's a ratcheting up of this, and it's understandable because the more force is used to settle political disputes, the more it's understandable because partly true that okay, so we've got to use force to get our political will done, and then it's well, look what they're doing, and it's a ratcheting up of force and violence, and that this is part of why it's crucial that it be cut off before it gets to that stage. And this is the conservatives and the MAGA crowd. This is like one of their major culpabilities. And take someone like a Ben Shapiro, who will be critical of some conservatives, but still supports Trump. That's part of how it ratchets up. Like he tries to present himself as reasonable, and yet he's on the side of force. He's on the side of someone who, above all anyone else in the country, is making the use of force in the political realm the norm. And that you can't let it get to that stage because it is hard to de-escalate when that happens. I mean, my view, to go to the emergency thing, the moment a politician tells me this is an emergency, he's lost my vote. This is scaremongering, fear-mongering. And when Trump, like everything, including we need tariffs because we're in an emergency, like everything's an emergency. Just from that perspective, I think someone should be unsupportable. Your situation would have to be so precarious to entertain the idea this is an emergency and we've got to have some like unusual use of political power, and America's nowhere close to that.
Yeah, this reminds me of there's a real value in thinking outside of the U.S. context and thinking of comparative examples. I brought up a couple of times the Mussolini Hitler. I don't think you need to go that far back. I've studied the Middle East in depth for many years, and one of the analogs to what you're saying here is for I think almost 30 years, Egypt was ruled by a military dictator, and the legal system was under the cloud of a perpetual emergency law, because it was an emergency that lasted 30 plus years. That wasn't even true when it was passed. It wasn't true for multiple decades in which it was enforced. And that should be something people think about. Like, this is a playbook, or this is something that's been done before. If you see it, you have to ask yourself, are we really in an emergency? We didn't have that. Even after 9/11, I don't think anyone credibly believed we were in an emergency, even though there was a need to go and retaliate against the Islamist threat that had inflicted so many deaths on Americans. We didn't have an emergency. It wasn't declared in the same way. It's not a natural disaster kind of scenario where people's homes are being flooded. It's not even close to that. But when it's routinely done, I think it loses meaning. It's just, well, this is just a way to get more power.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. The 9/11, the Egypt one. Yeah, I mean, many countries that, as you said, it's a playbook. So it's not like it only happened in Egypt, but Egypt is one. That after 9/11, that it wasn't an emergency. Part of what that means is there was real deliberation. You can say there was a lot of in that deliberation, a lot that was fake, a lot that was bad, but of should we go to Iraq? And if you contrast that to no, Trump needs emergency powers, and it's like day by day we've got 20% tariffs on this, or I'm rescinding that, or no, now I'm threatening Canada, and the justification is it's an emergency. And if you don't treat like after 9/11, no, there's gonna be a real case has to be made for what we're going to do, and so on, why, and does the president really have this authority, and so on. And that, like, more plausibly would have been labeled an emergency than what exists now. And that just tells you something about they're looking for ways in which to wield power unfettered by law, and by the Constitution.
So I think we should draw a line here. There's still more to say. We'll talk again soon. Thanks everyone for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.